No one sleeps better by trying harder to sleep.
Interesting.
The sensitivity of our stress response the day after a night of disrupted sleep is higher, which is why we get more emotional, irritable.
We have this hierarchy of hormones. Right at the top is cortisol and insulin. Sleep is really important because glucose regulation and sleep comes into that hormone management.
After, say, 5 days with 5 hours sleep, you can actually push people into a pre-diabetic state. We know that persistent sleep deprivation is linked to increased risks of diabetes.
Why am I waking up at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m?
If it's accompanied by feelings of anxiety and you're thinking, why have I woken up? What's wrong with me? I've got a sleep problem. I'm never going to fall back to sleep. Because the brain loves shortcuts, it can start to learn that your bed at 3 o'clock in the morning is the place where you wake up and feel anxious. The separate bedroom argument, controversy, which can sometimes come up. I really dislike it when it's called sleep divorce.
What are the practical steps we have to fix someone's sleep?
Heat is the enemy. Ditch the snooze button.
What about the people who are on shifts or the new mum?
I think about sleep advice as hitting one of 3 systems.
Hello and welcome to Finally Found, a podcast that is finally focusing on women's health and giving you the answers that you've been looking for. I'm Sophie Richards, and if you've ever found yourself waking up at 3 a.m. with your mind racing, or you're waking up feeling more exhausted than you went to sleep, then this episode is for you. I think we all know that sleep is one of the foundations of health, but it's not just about the 8 hours, it's about your rhythm. And when your sleep is off, everything can unravel. So I'm talking hormones, mood, energy, immunity, and even metabolism too. And that's why today's guest is here. Dr. Sophie Bostock is a sleep scientist, speaker, and the founder of Sleep Scientist, and her work bridges the gap between cutting-edge research and real-world practical tools. In this episode, we're going to talk about how stress impacts sleep, how women's hormones come into the picture when it comes to sleep, and the practical steps you can actually take, regardless of how chaotic your life is right now, to make sure that your sleep is the best it's ever been. Hello, Sophie, and welcome to Finally Found.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
I am genuinely so excited. We've just spent a good 20 minutes chatting in the cafe about what we're going to talk about. And I know everyone is in for such a treat because I know that I'm sat here currently on this 5 a.m. routine just out of necessity for work. And I'm not sure how I feel about it. So selfishly, I'm excited to chat to you about it. But I also know so many people listening will be struggling physically, emotionally, mentally, and might not know that sleep is the problem. So I just think there's so many things that we're going to cover today, but people are definitely going to know how to fix their sleep by the end of it. But first of all, I want to know why sleep. How did you get into sleep? What's the context?
Well, by accident, because I think, like a lot of people, sleep was something that I just totally took for granted. I'd studied medicine, so I was very interested in health and how to improve health. I went through my entire time at medical school with probably no more than about 5 or 10 minutes that they spent talking about sleep. I later on went and did a PhD, and I was very interested in the intersection between psychology and biology. So my degree was in something called psychobiology, and I was particularly interested in why happy people live longer. So a lot of people are aware that depression is associated with poorer outcomes, but at the other end of the spectrum, people who have a more positive outlook tend to have better health outcomes. And so I was fascinated with, okay, if happiness is good for us, how can we help ourselves to be happier? So I established this trial actually to test mindfulness meditation and use the app Headspace. And so we got hundreds of people in and they got to experiment with using this app. And after 8 weeks, a number of them came back and said, well, I don't know if I know how to meditate, but I'm definitely sleeping better. And when I looked at the data, I realised that the people who slept better, they felt less stressed. They felt happier. I was like, well, I don't know whether I can thank the meditation or the sleep, but actually this is a whole variable that I hadn't even considered. And so then I looked all into the research and I was like, this is an incredible lever, not just for our emotional health, but also for our physical health and our performance that people are not focused on and not appreciating. And so ever since then, I've really kind of made it my mission to just champion the importance of sleep.
It's so interesting. One of the first things you said about people that struggle with depression end up having shorter lives, which in itself is quite miserable.
It's really tragic, isn't it?
Yeah. But then also it gives me that push of like when I'm feeling negative, it's like, actually, so not only does feeling happier make you feel better in that moment, but it actually has some like longevity research behind it. So question about the research study that you did with Headspace. Was there any other factors that you were looking at in terms of, you said their stress reduced? Was anything changing in their lives, or was it just their sleep?
That was what was the interesting thing. We were focused on a particular model of work stress, which I think people appreciate whether or not you work or not. But what makes work stressful, according to this model called job strain, is a combination of high demands, so being expected to work intensively or fast, and this might be in your career, but it also might be if you've got caring responsibilities or something like that. If you constantly sort of feel under pressure, a combination of that plus low control, feeling like, you can't delegate, you're not in control of when you can do these things. You feel like somebody else is putting those demands on you. And so that combination of high demands and low control is linked to much poorer outcomes, particularly heart disease, which was what I was looking at. But you can bolster that. If you have strong social support, for example, that really helps to boost resilience. So even if your work feels overwhelming, if your colleagues, if your manager, if your family are there to support you, that's very protective. And so I guess there are, of course, other elements that are going to influence outcomes. But what the meditation did was not to influence demands. People still felt as though they had loads of things to do. But what it influenced was their sense of control. That actually, if they could master their own emotions, use mindfulness meditation to sort of bolster that muscle that enables us to control our emotional response, they felt like they could deal with it, they could cope with it. And we hadn't changed their work demands at all.
That is so interesting, because the first thing that I do when I'm stressed or overwhelmed or, like you said, lacking in control, the first thing I drop are those kind of self-care things of the 10-minute meditation. And I've been trying to, I really like Dr. Andrew Huberman, and he's got the NSDR video, which I'd love to link in the show notes if that's okay, Sophia, where it's like this restful thing and it's kind of like a guided meditation. And I try and do it every day, but when I'm stressed or back to back in meetings, it's the first thing I stop doing. But that or meditating could actually be the thing that helps me feel more in control, sleep better, feel less stressed by adding it in, not taking it away.
Yeah, and the irony is that actually, if you're very stressed or you're not sleeping well, it becomes much harder to engage in those relaxation techniques. People often say to me, I've tried meditation, it doesn't work for me. If you are immensely tired, your ability to focus, manage your concentration is so impaired that it can be very, very difficult. So I'll often suggest to people, okay, don't do anything too stationary. Don't just try and sit there and expect yourself to feel in control. Yeah. Take yourself for a walk. Try a mindful walking activity, focus on what you can see, hear, smell. But you can expend some of that sort of energy that you've got stored up with a physical activity, but still be mindful in what you're doing.
Okay, so what do you do if, and I know there'll be listeners because my dad, he won't be listening to this podcast because I don't think he knows what a podcast is, but he is someone who wakes up at 3 or 4 in the morning. He's a farmer, works crazy hours. He laughs at anything mindful, but is probably the person that needs it the most. So what do I tell him? Because I know I'll ring him today and I'll say, Dad, please, can you listen to this? Because you're stressed, you're anxious, you've got so much on. How do I get him to meditate without him thinking it's just airy-fairy?
Great question. I think the way that I think about both meditation and sleep and any other thing which is designed to help us to recover is to reframe recovery. Because most of us have in our heads that recovery is about getting back to where we were yesterday. And if you look up the definition of recovery in the dictionary, it will say something about getting back to baseline. But for me, recovery is not about that. That's the start. But when you get recovery right, it's about enhancing performance.
Yeah.
It's about becoming a better version of you. And it's very obvious if you think about muscles and trying to get stronger. You know, how do you do that? Well, you go to the gym and you lift some weights. But lifting those weights doesn't make you stronger. Lifting the weights makes you weaker. It's the recovery afterwards, the rest, that enables those damaged muscle fibers to knit together and to actually get stronger. But without the recovery, that's not going to happen. You're just going to damage them beyond repair.
That's so interesting.
We can think about our cognitive function in exactly the same way. If you are mentally exhausted, having spent the day rushing around, without that sort of decompression that enables you to go from a state of heightened activation, because that's what we're talking about. When we talk about stress, we're talking about turning on our stress response, adrenaline, cortisol, all the things that have evolved to help us to evade danger and threat, which is tremendously helpful if you need to get stuff done.
Yeah.
But when you need to go to sleep and recover, those very same mechanisms that evolved to help keep you alert are interfering. And the more those stress responses have been switched on during the day, and over weeks and months, they can almost become wedged in the on position, the more you have to focus and develop the skill of switching off the stress response to enable those performance enhancing capabilities to be unlocked. So, you know, for your dad, I'd say, look, if you want to have more energy, greater productivity tomorrow, then you need a decent amount of rest, but in able to get into good quality rest, you've got to switch off your stress response first. And mindfulness is one of the greatest tools that we have to do that.
That is such a good explanation. And it brings me back to, I used to follow this like bodybuilder. I don't ask why. And he used to talk about how he used to train 7 days a week, twice a day, thinking it would grow his muscles, but actually it's when he stripped it back to 3 to 4 sessions with real rest and like a light walk on a recovery day, that's when he saw the real growth. So all of these people who want to be mentally and physically stronger, what you're saying is the data is saying you have to rest to allow that growth to happen.
Yeah, what's interesting is I'm now very lucky to do some work with athletes, and the difference between an amateur athlete and a professional athlete is very often not necessarily the focus that they go into training with, because actually, if you're ambitious, you're going to work really hard. The difference is allowing yourself to recover in between training sessions, between day to day, having this sort of periodization where you trust yourself to have periods of rest before you go into your next block.
It's incredible. So it's not an airy-fairy thing. It's actually essential. And what I love that you said is that it's a skill you need to work on. It's something that we actively need to develop, which also goes for anyone listening to this who goes, oh, well, I'm just not someone who sleeps. I was just born like that. It's actually something we need to learn. And we're going to get into the practical steps because I'm sure that you've got a toolkit and I know that you've got a couple of props with you as well. I want to know, as a sleep expert, so in my mind, you have this like ritual that you follow to the second every day, but I'm sure there's been periods of your life where sleep has been a struggle.
Oh, like anybody else. I mean, worst example for me is if I have to go and give a huge presentation, or the worst, if occasionally I've been on TV and, you know, they roll out the sleep expert and you feel this pressure that you ought to look well slept and energetic. Yeah. But actually I have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get on the train into London to come into the studio. And the night before, first few times I was invited to do it, I was like, oh no, you know, this is going to be awful. This is going to be a disaster. Yeah. And I caught myself thinking those thoughts. And we all know that no one sleeps better by trying harder to sleep. Mm-hmm. And so I have to have a little chuckle to myself and just go, Sophie, let it go. Like, we can all cope with the occasional poor night of sleep. The thing that really gets in the way is when we start worrying about it. And then the worry amps up the stress response. And so then we lie there in a state of agitation, getting further and further away from rest. So in that sort of scenario, firstly, I have a little chuckle to myself. I go, it's okay that you're not feeling sleepy today. I maybe do a breathwork technique. I'll slow my breath down, maybe a little mindfulness. If it's not working after 15 or 20 minutes, I might turn the light on and read a book for a little bit, just distract myself. Because the moment that you stop trying so hard to fall asleep, then that is the time to switch the light off and give it another go.
I feel like it's such a breath of fresh air hearing you say that, because I honestly thought that you were going to have like a list of things that you were like, you've got to do this, otherwise this is really bad. But your whole attitude to just not just sleep, but health in general is like, yes, there are all of these tips and tricks that we can do, but just sometimes it doesn't work out, and that's okay. And it's actually better to just, like you say, let it go than to fixate on not being perfect.
I think with sleep, that is even more important than anything else. I think the biggest lesson that I had in this was when I first started working in sleep, and I was working for a company that had a sleep improvement program, and it was headed up by this wonderful professor called Professor Colin Espy, who's done a lot of work in treating insomnia. And he's published all this research about how important sleep is, particularly for mental health. And the very first time that I met him, we had a sort of a team away day, and we went out for dinner, and I kind of got to about 9:30, and I'm thinking, well, probably we ought to start wrapping up now so that we've got a good day's sleep before tomorrow. And of course, the professor was the last at the bar having a whiskey. He's Scottish. And I remember sort of looking at him and going, Colin, isn't it a bit late? Oughtn't we to be going to sleep?
Yeah.
And he sort of looked at me and he said, this is an opportunity to get to know my team. And the worst thing you can do about sleep is to worry about it. I know that most of the time I sleep really well. So the occasional night, so long as I don't worry about it, it's not going to have long-term effects.
Yeah.
So I've always tried since then to focus on that kind of 80-20 rule.
Yeah.
If 80% of the time I'm actually pretty disciplined, go to bed at a very similar time each day, it just leaves me that little bit of leeway for when life gets in the way.
It's so true, because and I'm again guilty, and we were talking about this before we started recording. I love a challenge, and I like something that I repeat every single day. But we have to be careful not to fall into that trap where, because you're fixated on, in quotations, living your best life, where you're like, I've got to be in bed at this time and I've got to do this at a certain point and I haven't done my workout or whatever, you end up in your quest to being your best self, to allow yourself to have these amazing opportunities, robbing yourself of those opportunities, like that late night where you were all getting to know each other and having a laugh probably after a couple of drinks. You end up not letting yourself experience that because you're so focused on getting this singular night of sleep, because without it, you think it's going to be the end of the world. But just like with food, just like with exercise, it's really nice to know that with sleep, the 80-20 rule still exists.
100%. And I think there will be people listening to this who have quite a rigid routine and they see that as a positive. And they're absolutely right. Like having familiarity, predictability, that sense of control is really beneficial for sleep until that gets disrupted for some reason, which is probably out of your control. And that can then lead to a lot of anxiety because you're like, I haven't been able to do my rigid, precise bedtime routine. Or you go traveling and everything is thrown out of the window. So I think building in some flexibility, some adaptability on a daily basis means that you're much less likely to be derailed by short deviations from the routine.
That's brilliant. I think something that I am fascinated by at the moment, and I was so excited to speak to you about, was I think everyone is wearing a fitness tracker right now. I am wearing a Whoop. I can see that you're wearing a Whoop. Perfect. I used to have an Apple Watch and I didn't like seeing the numbers on it. So I converted to Whoop. And ever since I've been so sleep conscious in all the best ways. But I find it so funny that after a night out, Dylan, if you're listening, I know that you do this. If he's going on a night out drinking, he'll take his Whoop off because he doesn't want to see the recovery the next day. And I love it then when people are like health queens and we'll go to brunch and they'll be like, what was your recovery yesterday? What was it? Well, I had 3 hours of REM actually. So what actually is sleep versus rest? Because you talk about rest and I'm like, do you just mean I'm chilling out on the sofa, or do you mean like you're fast asleep? And what's the deal with the stages of sleep? Because not everyone might know what they are and if they're actually important. Like, does REM versus light sleep actually make a difference?
Okay, lots of questions in there.
Sorry.
Let me start with a little bit the difference between how I think about rest versus sleep. So for me, rest is restorative, and that can include a whole vast array of activities. Let's imagine you have a job where you're on your feet all day doing something both cognitively and emotionally demanding. Think of healthcare workers, for example. Rest for them might well be certainly going to be something that takes them out of that environment, doesn't have the same kinds of demands, but it might be physically demanding in a different way, going for a run, going sailing, going rowing, getting themselves out into nature. Physically, it's still demanding, but it's got an awful lot less of a cognitive and emotional load to it. So we can think, about sort of physical recovery, cognitive recovery, emotional recovery. I think the one thing that gives us all of those all at once is sleep.
Okay.
And if you could design the most restorative process, it would always be sleep. But we've also been designed to sleep ideally overnight. If we have control over our daytime routines, then we're going to get the best quality sleep at night. So during the day, a little nap, that's also going to be restorative. But there are probably other ways of recovering, of giving yourself rest. Just taking a break is often overlooked. You know, when you're really, really busy, just taking 5-10 minutes to just be rather than do. Subtle difference, but just enjoying not scrolling through your phone, not being bombarded with lots of different information, but almost sitting internally and just sort of breathing, doing. So yeah, difference between rest and sleep. Sleep is a different process. It's multiple things. As you said, we sleep in different stages. And in some ways, I'm not too worried about what someone's map of sleep looks like. We have in our minds this picture. If you have any kind of wearable device, it will give you what we call a hypnogram, a little map of what's been happening during the night and which stages you've gone into. But for the most part, these wearables, and I'm a fan because it helps people to look at their sleep consistency, which is important, and their sleep duration, but they've still got a bit of work to do in terms of how accurate they are with different sleep staging. But we don't have a perfect recipe for what those stages look like. We have averages and we can compare ourselves to average.
Yeah.
But I try and steer people away from caring too much about how much time they spend in the different stages. But I can give you a hint of what happens at the different levels. So the first stage of sleep, if anybody's feeling a little bit weary right now, maybe they're in a slightly warm room, they're already relaxed, they may find the eyelids starting to close and the head starting to nod. Just as you lose consciousness, you go into this light stage of sleep. You sometimes feel that sensation of falling, which is just stage 1 sleep. As far as we know, it's not very restorative. And it's the same kind of sleep that you get typically if you press the snooze button in the morning and you get, 5-6 minutes of sleep.
Yeah.
Ditch the snooze button. That is the kind of sleep that's not really doing you huge favours. In order to have restorative value, you really want to get into stage 2, which usually happens after about 9 or 10 minutes. And that's when we start to see heart rate, breathing rate slow down, and you start to see these differences in your brain waves, and we start to see consolidation of memory. So even a 20-minute nap, where we might only have had 10 minutes of stage 2 sleep, we know that it improves your mood, it improves your focus, your concentration for up to 3 hours afterwards. That is how powerful sleep is, that just a 20-minute nap can have that impact.
I was going to ask actually, because naps, sometimes I wake up and I'm like, I can take on the world. Other times I wake up and I'm like, I don't know where I am right now. Why does that happen?
So that happens, great segue, when you wake up from stage 3 sleep. So after around half an hour, and it depends how sleep deprived you've been. If you're really sleep deprived, you might nip into stage 3 sleep a little bit earlier. But stage 3 sleep is the most physically restorative stage of sleep. We release most of our growth hormone, our immune system goes to work, we start to manage our metabolism, improve our glucose regulation, DNA repair goes on. It's a busy time for our bodies, but it is also the most relaxed, deeply relaxed time. And I always think about it like taking your car to the garage. They don't fix it when it's moving along. They fix it when it's very definitely stationary. And deep sleep is that really deep repair function. But then in the second part of the night, so we might have 5 or 6 sleep cycles during the night, we'll get some cycles that have got more REM, rapid eye movement sleep. And that's often associated more with emotional restoration. Also important for creativity and memory. A lot of dreaming happens during REM sleep. But it really helps us, I think, to separate out emotions from facts when we think back on the past. So I can look back on yesterday and say, oh yeah, that was embarrassing, but without feeling the embarrassment.
Yeah.
Because REM sleep has been this sort of emotional balm over my experience.
There's so much that I want to pick out of this. So first of all, before I forget, that last thing that you've said about the emotional side of it, my friend Liv, if you're listening to this, because she was very excited about this particular episode, she is someone that after a couple of drinks, it doesn't matter if she's done anything embarrassing or not, the next day, I know I'm getting a text from her that's like, oh my God, do I need to be embarrassed? Da, 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 da. To the point where now I'm consciously thinking if she's out for a drink, I'm like, I'm going to text her so that she wakes up to a text being like, nothing went wrong yesterday. Is it because she hasn't gone into that emotional side where she's able to just process it in her sleep and let it go?
The likelihood is if you've been drinking alcohol, you have a REM suppression. So yes, you absolutely get less REM sleep after alcohol. It's one of the strongest impacts. And going back to trackers or no trackers, the fact that Dylan doesn't like to wear his when he's out, I think one of the real values, actually, I've come across a lot of people who have reduced the amount that they're drinking because they look at the impact on their recovery and are like, oh, okay, maybe it's not really worth it. But early hours of the morning, we get more REM sleep.
So interesting. Okay, so Liv, if you're listening, it's not you, it's the alcohol. And you just need more REM sleep. So another thing that you said is about how, I think, was it stage 3, you said that that's when it starts to go into glucose regulation.
It seems to be particularly important for moderating next day glucose metabolism,
Okay, so I'm currently writing a book called The Anti-Inflammatory Reset, and a big part of it is going to be talking about sleep, and I'm obsessed with women's health and hormones. And we have this hierarchy of hormones, and I always used to think that all hormones were exactly the same. They all had the same importance. And even though they are all important, right at the top, so they're kind of like the CEO hormones that influence all the others, is cortisol and insulin. So obviously both of those play into sleep. Can you talk a little bit about how specifically as a woman, sleep is really important? Because I'm assuming that glucose regulation and sleep comes into that hormone management.
Oh, definitely. So your insulin sensitivity after sleep deprivation will go down to the extent that I think there have been various studies, which I'll probably misquote, but after, say, 5 days with 5 hours sleep, you can actually push people into a pre-diabetic state. So their insulin sensitivity has gone down. Now, the good news is that you can recover within a couple of days. But if you imagine that that's happening on a short-term basis, month after month, year after year, we know that persistent sleep deprivation is linked to increased risks of diabetes. That's really sort of clear from the literature. And then in terms of cortisol, that is a hormone that I talk about a lot in relation to sleep. And the fact is that the relationship between stress and sleep, as we've already talked about, is very much bidirectional. So short sleep means that your brain interprets the situation as thinking, okay, why have I not slept? And hundreds of thousands of years ago, our ancestors thought that, or experienced sleep debt at times when they were in danger. And so our brains have evolved to see short sleep as probably indicating that we're under threat. And so the next day, we're going to amp up our stress hormones. The sensitivity of our stress response the day after a night of disrupted sleep is higher. Our amygdala that switches on our fight or flight stress response becomes 60% more sensitive to negative threats the following day, which is why we get more emotional, irritable. We tend to see the same situation from a perspective of danger rather than, this is a challenge that I can deal with. So lack of sleep shapes our stress response. And of course, if our stress response is switched on, then it influences our sleep patterns. And in particular, that deep sleep. Because if deep sleep is where our body is really out for the count and it takes us quite a long time to wake up from that deep sleep state, as you mentioned, you can get this sleep inertia. So from an evolutionary perspective, the brain goes, well, I don't want to get into deep sleep because that could be dangerous. I'm not going to be able to run away in that state. And so when we're stressed, we tend to see there's less deep sleep. Sleep is more fragmented, so we wake up more times in the night. which for our ancestors was highly advantageous, because if you can just check there's no saber-toothed tigers around, that's good, get back to sleep. But that is probably the primary reason that I see for people with very broken sleep. It's these amped up levels of cortisol, or at least the stress response is on an on position.
We'll come back to that, because so many questions. Before a podcast in the morning, I always put a Q&A for the audience to ask their questions. So at the end, we'll go through them all. But the thing that came up the most was, why am I waking up at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. all the time? And it was just a sea of women saying the same thing. But I want to talk quickly about how you said about I think it was 60% more stress the next day.
Sort of the sensitivity of the amygdala that switches on the stress response seems to be, more sensitive. So the same situation will be perceived by your brain in a different way.
So you're basically on high alert, waiting, because I know I'm jumpy. Like, a door will close and I'll be like, what's there? And I'm not a jumpy person, but it is literally just that sleep thing. And it's trying to prepare me just in case there's something around.
Absolutely.
So again, your body's trying to protect you.
When you see it from that perspective, you're like, oh yeah, this is actually kind of natural.
Yeah.
But it also influences even your perception of facial expressions. I often use an example where I'll flash up some different faces onto the screen and get people to identify which of them are hostile or angry.
Yeah.
And the more sleep deprived you are, the more likely you are to interpret a sort of bland, neutral face as threatening, because your sense of threat is heightened.
There's two things that's so interesting, because I used to be corporate queen, and I remember a big part of it, which I found exhausting, was constantly having to read people. How are they perceiving me in this presentation? Because you were never just presenting about the topic. It was also
they're judging you.
It was going towards, are you going to get promoted? Are you a leader? Are you blah, 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 blah. So if I'm well rested, I'm thinking, God, go Soph, you're doing a great job.
I'm surrounded by a great group of people that are smiling at me. That's what you're thinking.
If I've had shit sleep, I'm going, oh my God, my boss hates me.
They hate me, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not getting this promotion. So it's not just important for, again, this like airy fairy, oh, it's nice to be rested. It's like, if you want the best out of your career and the best out of your ability to read people's body language, which is such an important skill that everyone understands now, you need to sleep well. But also, I was just thinking when you were saying it, I'm such a bad TikTok scroller. And I'm seeing literally thousands of faces on my screen every day. So I might be reaching, but even if I've had bad sleep, it's dictating how positive or negative I'm seeing these faces as on my screen.
It's like, I often think about people talk about rose-tinted spectacles that make you see the world in a more positive way. Lack of sleep is like putting on kind of grey spectacles that everything feels like, ugh.
Bit miserable.
Yeah. A bit down, maybe, a bit threatening.
Interesting. I want to say a quick thank you to Boira, the incredible sponsor of the Finally Found podcast, for making a product I genuinely use and love. TENS technology has changed my life when it comes to pain and cramping. It stands for transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation and works by sending small impulses to interrupt pain signals, meaning natural pain relief without the medication. From their collection, a personal favourite is the Boira EM50 TENS machine, because it also has heat technology too. It's my go-to, especially when I'm cramping, travelling, or just need pain relief fast. And yes, it's small, discreet, and completely reusable. The link to my favourite TENS machine that I mentioned is in the show notes. And Boira has given us an exclusive listener discount, so just use code FOUND at checkout and enjoy. Now let's get back to the episode. Okay, so the 3 a.m. thing.
Yes.
Why is that such a big thing? Because I have spoken to loads of women who are going through perimenopause and menopause who talk more about this 3 p.m. thing, but I also get it. So it can't just, and I'm not perimenopausal. So why does it happen?
Oh yeah, look, we can all wake up during the night. And in fact, the first thing to note is that waking up during the night is normal for anyone, because we sleep in these cycles of progressively deeper and then lighter sleep. Very often, anybody and everybody can have a brief period of wakefulness, which usually just involves kind of rolling over, maybe, maybe shrugging off some cover or something, but then going straight back to sleep. You're not even going to remember it in the morning. But what can happen when you start waking up, when your body brain is in a state of arousal, is that you wake up and you immediately feel anxious.
I'm always like, I've missed my alarm. What time is it?
Yeah.
And you panic.
And if you notice that your heart is beating a little bit faster, maybe you're a little bit hot, that often means that the stress response has switched on, your high alert system has been activated. And unfortunately, the more often it happens, if it's accompanied by feelings of anxiety, so, you've probably heard, you maybe listen to a podcast saying sleep is really important. And you're thinking, why have I woken up? What's wrong with me? I've got a sleep problem. I'm never going to fall back to sleep. And then because the brain loves shortcuts, it can start to learn that your brain at your bed at 3 o'clock in the morning is the place where you wake up and feel anxious. And you can almost get yourself into a rhythm, into a routine where it happens again and again. Because if waking up and feeling anxious and being in a state of high alert becomes familiar, you sort of work your way into that pattern. So the obvious question is, well, what can I do about that?
Yeah.
And so you can look at the causes. So it might be psychological. So from a perspective of psychological stressors, we've already talked about the importance of feeling in control and having a regular routine, which is predictable and slowly kind of eases the body into a state of relaxation, is going to help. That's a necessary sort of precursor. But you can have physiological stresses as well. And that's really where I think perimenopause and even certain times of a woman's cycle come into play. And what's interesting is it's not necessarily one particular hormone. It's not high levels of estrogen or low levels of progesterone. The research seems to suggest that it's really times of hormonal flux that can cause this stress on the body. I mean, stress really is anything that tips our body out of its normal state of equilibrium. So if you have hormones that are going around in circles, a little bit up, a little bit down, the body goes, something's going on here. And it pushes up your cortisol levels. You're in a state of higher activation. So very often for women who are not menopausal, it's going to be just the second half of the cycle. And the luteal phase, you get this rapid decline in estrogen and progesterone. So for some people, every month they experience this increased sort of awakening. Also, the second part of the cycle is associated with a higher body temperature.
Yeah.
And particularly in perimenopause, your thermoregulation is a bit messed up. One of the things that happens when you have low levels of estrogen is that you have difficulty often setting your thermostat. It becomes a bit hypersensitive. And so people can be more prone to hot flushes and night sweats, which is pretty unpleasant. So you wake up bathed in sweat, feeling quite anxious. Yeah. And to some extent, just knowing, okay, my hormones are going haywire. It's nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
All I need to do is I need to switch off that stress response. I need to bring that state of activation down. So some mindfulness, some slow breathing, just perhaps some positive visualization of taking your brain, make sense of the sweat. Sort of imagine yourself on your favorite beach and just sort of lie there and just bask. And you don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to do anything.
Yeah.
Just allow yourself to relax. Don't blame yourself for what's happened or get frustrated, because that's going to make things worse.
What you just said is such a relief, because honestly, I know this is going to sound ridiculous. Maybe not ridiculous because you're a sleep expert. But last night I woke up, I feel so bad for Dylan because he plays rugby. He's got such a physical job. And I have no problem waking him up if I feel like something's wrong. And recently, I'm not currently stressed now, but the last 6 months, I think it's just been writing this book. I've wanted everything to be perfect, that it's just literally kept me up at night. And I woke up last night, heart was racing, I was sweating. I was like, Christ, am I perimenopausal? Because I'm 28, but I was like, it does happen. It happens in early 20s even. And I was like, no, it can't be that. I've got regular periods, this, that, and the other. And I just shook him. I was like, Dylan, I don't know what's going on. And he, bless him, he woke up and he goes, do I need to call an ambulance? And I was like, no, we're not there yet. But what you just said about how it is actually common to wake up with that.
So common. And remember, at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, your very logical, rational prefrontal cortex, this
there.
Kind of bit in your forehead, is asleep.
She's not there.
Fast asleep. Often takes about probably 10, 20 minutes to fully come back online. So when you wake up in the morning, the first part of your brain to wake up is your amygdala, is your stress response. And it's just going to make sure everything's okay before it allows you to get back to sleep. So sometimes just taking 5 or 10 minutes to take some slow breaths to help ease that amygdala. And then your prefrontal cortex comes back online and goes, everything's all right, don't know what you're worrying about,
Yeah,
and
you're
you can go back to
fine.
sleep. But I would say if you do wake up, and it's interesting, you tapped your chest, you can become conscious of that heartbeat.
Yeah.
I often recommend to people, very simple strategy, putting one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly. It's like giving yourself a little hug. So I'm lying there in bed, and this skin on skin contact can be very soothing. And so if you do this, and then you just notice where you're breathing, and very often, 2:00 in the morning, you're going to notice that your breath has come up to your chest and is quite sort of shallow, because you get that sort of panic breath, the shallow sort of panting for survival breath. Or you get a freeze response where your breathing just kind of stops. And what you want is just a solid, slow, controlled breath deep into your belly. And just by concentrating on moving the breath deep into the belly, pause and breathe out through the belly, can really help to bring your heart rate back down again.
What I think is insane as well is, and I'm curious to see if any listeners or people watching have noticed as well, when you were talking about the heart racing and that, I could feel myself like rattling up with you. And then your voice, I don't know if you have audiobooks, but you really should. I don't care what they're on, I'd listen. You've got the most calming voice when you go back into it. And then I could feel myself winding down. So it is that thing of like, if you just make yourself slow down, focus on your breath, it'll probably take your brain off that, take my brain off the fact that I think I'm dying in my sleep.
Yeah. And think about the tone that you're using. You're not talking out loud, but the tone that you use to yourself. I think of two things: humour. Oh gosh, I'm a sleep expert and I've woken up in the middle of the night. This is hilarious. And the second one, soothing. Think about this prehistoric brain of yours that just thinks that there's a saber-toothed tiger outside the door, and there isn't one. And you just need to be kind and go, oh, this is normal. This is totally normal, and it's okay. And however you're feeling is okay.
What you said earlier as well about having the fluctuating hormones. So even if you're not perimenopausal or menopausal, just having a cycle. I just feel like as women, we're kind of cursed. You know, when it's like sleep is one of the foundations of health, but we have a cycle that comes every month, if all is well and good, where you are pretty much guaranteed not to have great sleep. And then when that cycle goes, you go through perimenopause and menopause, which also then means you've got even more fluctuating hormones. So sleep goes out the window as well.
Well, you say that. But what's really interesting is statistically, women are 60% more likely to suffer from insomnia than men.
What is insomnia exactly?
Insomnia would be a chronic sleep problem. So there'll be a lot of people listening who maybe struggle to fall asleep or wake up in the middle of the night. Now, at the point where that has a negative impact on your daytime functioning, so whether that's your work or your relationships or caring, if this sleep problem is getting you down for 3 nights a week for 3 months or more, that would be classified as insomnia disorder. So really it's just a chronic sleep dissatisfaction, if you like. And we know that women are at higher risk. But what's also interesting is actually when you get women into the lab, very often their sleep is deeper than men. It's almost that their perception of their sleep or their dissatisfaction with their sleep is higher. And nobody's really sort of worked this out, but there are definitely differences between male and female sleep. So on average, although everyone is recommended to get a minimum of 7 hours of sleep, we are all different. And I often liken it to something like your height or your shoe size, where there's lots of natural variation. So most of us need between 7 and 9 hours sleep. Statistically, women typically get around 20 to 30 minutes more sleep than men. So it may be that we actually have a slightly higher sleep need than men. And we haven't really kind of worked out why. Also, our body clocks, our internal rhythms, seem to run about 15 or 20 minutes earlier than men's on average. And I think this is a helpful thing to know if you are in constant conflict with your partner about when you're going to go to bed. You genuinely may need more sleep than your partner. We're all different. These are averages. But it's okay to need a slightly different amount of sleep.
So basically, if you need more sleep than your partner, you're allowed to just be like, I'm going to leave you on the sofa. I need an extra half an hour, an hour.
Yeah, 100%. Don't try and match your patterns to someone else necessarily. It's going to be so much better for your relationship if you're both well rested. And this kind of comes on to the separate bedroom argument, controversy, which can sometimes come up. And I really dislike it when it's called sleep divorce, which I think is completely unhelpful.
So basically sleeping in separate rooms.
In separate rooms, separate beds. And I think about it as a sleep holiday. You know, if you get better quality rest in another room and you are able to have another room where you can go and sleep, go for it. I mean, don't just do it in a huff, because that's going to lead to conflict. But if you sort of say, you know, you're wriggling around, your heat, your snoring really disrupts my sleep. So actually on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, I'm going to go sleep in the other room. But before we go to bed, we can still have a cuddle. You can make me a coffee or a cup of tea and still come into bed in the morning. We're not saying no intimacy. We're just saying sleep in separate rooms. There is nothing wrong with that.
And maybe having the conversation before going to bed, so it's not a shock.
Because
so it's really funny. Me and Dylan, first night he stayed over in my flat, my flat was super cheap, right? The walls were so thin, so thin. And my flatmate Hannah came into my room the next morning when he left, and she said he's never fucking staying again. He's never doing it, because his snoring, it's not normal. Because he's a rugby player, his neck is thicker than his face. It's a roar. It's an absolute roar. And I am someone, okay, who, if you were tapping now, I'd have to go, I'm really sorry, do you mind not doing that? Because it would do my head in. Don't ask why. I genuinely think it's a gift from God. His snoring is my sleep thing. And if he can't sleep, it puts me on edge, because I'm like, he's not snoring now, I can't go to sleep. So I need him to roar me to sleep.
So you've learned that that's your sleep association.
Yes.
So, you know, often we'll talk about people having a fan on or white noise, which can soothe other noises. He's almost become that sort of soothing noise.
Yeah. But then he had the audacity to tell me, I went on holiday and I spent every night up until 2 a.m. in this state of panic of is someone going to come into my room at night? I get really scared sleeping on my own. Everyone knows if Dylan's away, I have to go over to their house, and I'm almost 30. I can't do it. He had the audacity to tell me that he sleeps better when he's sleeping on his own. After the sound that he's put me through to now, where it's my automatic sleep routine. But then I was really offended. I was like, I've just spent a week feeling really sad that I don't get to snuggle up to you at night, and you've just told me you've had the best sleep of your life.
It can lead to some disagreements, this whole sort of sleep thing. It's interesting. In the lab, often men will say they sleep better with their partner with them, whereas women typically, or very often, will say actually they sleep worse when their partner is with them.
Brilliant. So it's just me then.
We're all different. But I would say, you know, we've all got to be able to sleep independently. And if you end up traveling quite a lot, you know, you don't want to be dependent on another human or anyone else to sleep well. So thinking about, is there another element of your routine that you could take with you? So I've got used to sleeping with an eye mask and also with earplugs, because I know that if I travel, I can create the same sensation, the same cocoon anywhere I go. And actually, I did bring my little props with me. So I have an eye mask, because everyone always asks me, you know, what should I buy to help me sleep better? And they mean supplements. But honestly, I would always say an eye mask, shield your eyes from light. That just on its own is going to help with the depth of your sleep. But also, once you get used to it, this is something you can take anywhere. You can take it on a plane, on a train, wherever you're going to stay, that creates familiarity. So often for one night or 2 nights, people say, oh, I don't like them. I couldn't get used to it. But once you get used to it, then it's a really flexible tool. The other thing that I brought with me is my cuddly sloth. And I didn't anticipate that you might have problems sort of sleeping in different places. But when I travel, I find sort of the same thing. And actually, we have an effect called the first night effect that affects anyone. When you go and sleep somewhere new, part of your brain is going, am I safe? And so we know that your sleep becomes lighter in the first time that you sleep in a new environment. So anything that you can do, again, to make it feel familiar, give yourself a sense of control, is a good thing. So I will either travel with my partner or my cuddly sloth. And the reason that is a cuddly toy is I once listened to a brilliant talk by an astronaut called Mike Massimino. And he said that NASA had advised them when they went up into space to take a cuddly toy with them, because you've got this soft sort of sensation of home, it smells of home, and it's that sense of familiarity. So I'm like, if it's good enough for a NASA astronaut, it's good enough for me, and it's coming with me.
And guilt-free as well.
Yeah.
This is so interesting, because I've been trying to figure out my issues with sleep. So ever since I was a child, really struggle with sleep. I was like 13, like really quietly tapping on the door because I knew it must be like mother's instinct. Because if I woke my dad up, oh my God, all hell would have broken loose. Honestly, I would have been furious. But my mum would just be a bit like pissed off and then she'd be like, oh, fine, I'll come in and sleep with you. And then I'd be like, oh my God, I finally get to sleep. But it was like a real chronic issue until iPads came out. And I begged one for Christmas and we were all supposed to share it, but it was mine. I used to go to sleep with my iPad playing YouTube videos and I would literally watch it until I'd fall asleep. But a lot of my problems, which I'm now only really piecing together after speaking to you about it, is that I would often wake up with endometriosis pain. So it would literally be this thing. It would be this twisting pain in my stomach. And I'd sometimes wake up with like my whole body almost like flipping open like that, like as if you've got caught in like a deck chair. And I'd get out of bed and I'd be like, and there were so many times, especially with my ex-partner when I was in uni, where I'd literally grab him and it really was like off to A&E straight away. Sometimes ended up having surgery. And so I'm now wondering whether actually my worry about sleeping on my own is worried that something's
some of
going
that
to go
association
wrong.
that you learned way back when you used to wake up with immense pain, and there is probably an element of that you've got this learned association. And that's one of the reasons that people say, don't get into bed unless you're actually really sleepy, because otherwise your brain learns that your bed is a place to just lie awake at night and worry about things. But I'd say there's a couple of things to unpack there, one of which is screens, which I think is really important to talk about, because there's actually an incorrect assumption for a lot of people that screens are a really bad thing when it comes to sleep. And the reality is that, as most people will have heard, light from screens can impact on our body clocks, our internal circadian rhythms that thrive on routine.
I was going to ask about that circadian rhythm. It comes up all the time in sleep. For anyone who's never heard of it, what does it actually mean?
So a circadian rhythm, circa means about, day, about a day. We have these 24-hour rhythms which are programmed into every cell and system on our bodies. And the reason this is important is because when we have a regular routine, all of our moving parts fit together beautifully. The body's logistics function is able to predict what's going to happen next. And so you start to wake up before your alarm with a lovely natural peak in cortisol. That's when you want lots of cortisol. But before bed, cortisol dies off. About an hour and a half to 2 hours before your normal bedtime, melatonin, the sleep hormone that helps to prepare the brain and body for sleep, starts to be released. But melatonin is also called the darkness hormone, and too much bright light can interfere with that natural rise in melatonin. So there's lots of excitement about this when people realise that people were taking laptops and screens and phones to bed, because there seemed to be a lot of research that suggested that people who use screens in bed before sleep get less sleep overall and have worse quality sleep. So we must blame the screens. But actually, much more recent research suggests that people who fall asleep in front of the TV often fall asleep more easily and have better quality sleep. It seems that the impact of light is very, very small. It might suppress your melatonin a little bit, might delay it by about 10 minutes. But the real problem is when people are scrolling for like an hour at a time. They lose sleep time because they can't sort of switch it off. There's that dopamine response. We're compelled to do more. But it may not be that that was caused by the screen. It may be that there was a level of cognitive activation there that people are trying to suppress. Because when you've got a very overactive mind, those distractions take you away from some of those anxious thoughts. They dull the emotional experience. So actually, you've got to think about, well, why are people using screen? If you just take the screen away and leave someone with their thoughts, that may not be the best solution. You've got to kind of treat the underlying problem. And if it's about, okay, too many thoughts, too many worries, too much activation, then think about, okay, during the day, are there opportunities to practice the skill of relaxation? Could you do some journaling and bring some of those thoughts out? Therapy is another way of bringing thoughts out so that you're not just left there at night overthinking. So if you're an overthinker, it may well be that using your phone for a set time, set yourself an alarm that says, right, after 15 minutes, I'm going to try and switch this off, or listen to an audiobook, but put the timer on for 20, 25 minutes. But there's probably nothing wrong with using sounds, music to just deflect some of those negative thoughts.
So interesting, because I hear so many people talk about sleep and how screens are the devil. And yet you are one of the leading sleep experts in the world. And you're saying actually a bit of screen time isn't that bad, but it's being sensible with it, not stimulating your brain too much.
Yeah, and you've always got to be prepared to sort of change your tune based on the science. And I think the relationship goes both ways. So certainly some people, if you get some teenagers who are really not tired and you give them some video games to play, like because their games are so awe-inspiringly addictive, they may not be able to stop. And so, yes, the screen has interfered with their sleep. But for other people, I think if they bring activation and worry into bed, the screens can be a helpful tool to help deflect that, particularly calming music, hypnosis, meditation, all those things.
Okay, so that is so useful. And I want to get into what other practical steps we have to either fix someone's sleep or just in general, what's like the best routine end to end? Because I know, and I used to be one of these people who'd be like, well, I just don't need that much sleep, or I'm not someone who sleeps. I'll never be able to sleep. But actually, it's not true, is it? Like, it is a skill, like you said at the very start of this podcast. So how can we build that skill? What do we need to do?
Okay, so first thing is believe that it's important.
Yes.
I mean, that's really the key. Mm-hmm. If you, most people with sleep problems either don't worry enough about sleep because they don't think it's important, or they worry too much. And we've talked a lot about worry and how that's unhelpful. So you've got to prioritize it the right amount. And I would say having a plan is one of the key things.
Yeah.
Interestingly, research in teenagers is some of the most sleep deprived populations. The best thing you can do for them is actually give them a structure and say, okay, this time is bedtime. Mm-hmm. And just by setting a rule, it's like you're less likely to get distracted if you say, do you know what, every night, 9:30, 10 p.m, whatever it is, that's the time when I'm going to wind down. So set a rule for the time that you're going to try and switch off and relax and start that sort of bedtime routine. Don't set an alarm for when you need to fall asleep, because nobody can do that. But what we can do is give ourselves a runway. So I think about sleep advice as hitting one of three systems which influence sleep timing and quality. And we've mentioned two of them already. So circadian rhythms thrive on routine. Yeah. So if we start first thing in the morning, just setting an alarm at the same time each day, 7 days a week, is going to be really helpful.
Question on that.
Yeah.
I have the luxury of doing that. I feel like you do as well. What about the people who are on shifts?
Yeah.
Or the new mum?
And they are not in control. Yeah. And the good news is we have 3 different sleep systems.
Okay, amazing.
And you've kind of almost got to go, okay, well, my circadian rhythms are going to get messed up by shift work.
Yeah.
We can try and limit some of the disruption, but ultimately we might have to focus on the other 2 systems.
Okay,
so
amazing.
Do what you can out of getting up at the same time as often as possible.
Yeah.
Get some bright light certainly within the first hour of the day. Mm-hmm. Super easy in the summer when it's beautifully light outside.
Now is perfect, isn't it?
But in the winter, that really can cause problems. So sometimes having a light alarm clock or even a sad lamp that you put on for half an hour in the morning when you have your breakfast can really help to reset those circadian rhythms. Mm-hmm. Moving your body within the first couple of hours of the day, that's another trigger for your internal rhythms that it's daytime, it's time to get amongst it. It's going to help to reduce those levels of lagging melatonin that can help make you feel sleepy in the morning. Mm-hmm. And eating something in the morning. And I know there's lots of different schools of thought on fasting, and you've got to find out what works for you. Yeah. But from a sleep perspective, it feels like giving the brain these triggers of light and food and movement are all things that sort of get you going for the day. Mm-hmm. In the afternoon, we want to get some natural sunlight as well. It makes you just feel good and also supports your circadian rhythms. And then thinking about, okay, a couple of hours before bed, and actually Whoop came out with a study just 2 weeks ago that suggested that intense exercise within 4 hours of bed will not only delay sleep time, but disrupt the quality of your sleep. Wow. Which is more than most people ever thought. You know, we'd often give the advice to avoid intense exercise, maybe an hour before bed. Yeah. But potentially even 4 hours before bed, you've got to give your body time to wind down afterwards.
Yeah. So for people who are finishing work, then going to the gym, scramming in food and then going straight to bed, probably not the best routine. So in the morning, I won't do exercise unless I do it in the morning because I'm lazy. So unless it's done then, it's just done. But that's actually a good routine.
But that's also, it fits your circadian rhythm.
Yeah.
So some people are more early birds, and you're probably one of them.
Yes.
I'm more of an early bird, so I'll naturally want to do my exercise in the morning. But if you're a night owl, you often will struggle to get going first thing in the morning, but it might feel more natural to you to work out sort of after work. I'm always trying to encourage people, actually, if you can consume some calories, have a bit of a meal before, allowing time to digest, but before you go and work out. Otherwise, it can end up getting pushed really late. So if you go and exercise, you leave the gym at 8, you go home, you have something to eat at 9. In an ideal world, we want to allow at least 2 hours, if not 3 hours, after that last meal before you get into bed, so that you've digested, and also because your circadian rhythms are more ready to take in fuel earlier on in the day during daylight hours. And I think there seems to be quite a lot of research suggesting that having a shorter window of the day, compressing your eating times to daylight hours, seems to be better for your circadian rhythms and your sleep.
So now that we've covered the first system, what are the other two?
The other two are a bit more straightforward in a way. So the second system, I talk about sleep pressure, which is the build-up of a sleepiness drive, the more hours that you've been awake. And this is almost the friend to shift workers, because if your circadian rhythms are really skew-if, it's okay, because after a certain point, you will have built up this sleepiness drive, having been awake for so long, that will help you to fall asleep. But that's what we mess with stimulants like caffeine. So caffeine blocks this sleep drive, and most people are well aware of that. But there is a huge amount of variation in our sensitivity to caffeine, and I think sometimes we underestimate it.
Yeah.
So on average, the research suggests that we should stop drinking coffee 8.8 hours before we sleep. And if you're having caffeine any less than that, you might still sleep, but your sleep might be a little bit lighter, a little bit less restorative as a result. So again, it's something to just experiment with. What happens if you shift your consumption of caffeine forward in the day? Do you end up feeling more energized the following morning?
So rounding it up to like 9 hours, if my bedtime's 10, no coffee after 1. What about, this is one of the questions from the audience, what about decaf?
Big fan.
Because it's still a tiny bit.
Yeah, very
tiny,
little,
tiny.
Very little. Less than in, say, a soft drink.
Okay.
So typically, I think it has to contain like fewer than 9 milligrams per 100 millilitres or something of caffeine. So levels of caffeine in decaf drinks are very, very low.
And matcha? Because everyone's on the matcha hype, but it still has caffeine in it, right?
Yeah, so it's going to contain less than black tea, and there's lots of variation. But I think a lot of us are just not aware. We're not tracking the amount of caffeine that we consume.
Yeah.
So even just going through the process of, for a couple of days, tracking what are you consuming that contains caffeine, and challenging yourself to change it, seeing if it has a response.
Interesting.
So that's the second system. And then the third system is the stress system that we've talked a lot about. And I think that really does just come down to rehearsing the skill of relaxation, getting better at going from a state of arousal to a state of relaxation. And I think some of the more interesting research around this is that we can train our system to switch off more easily, sometimes by giving it a bit of stress. So the things like cold water immersion, which are actually really stressful for the body, the value of those is a sudden stress response, but then recovery. And if we can train the body to do that, yes, I get stressed, but I recover more easily, that's going to make us more adaptable, more flexible, so that we can switch off more easily at night.
This is so interesting because me and Dylan have got into a routine where, God, Dylan's really featured in this podcast today. He's going to be delighted. We have started getting to a routine where maybe 2 to 3 times a week, we'll go in the evening just to do the sauna, a little cold plunge, and I sleep like a baby that night. So is it because of that?
Do you finish with the cold plunge or the sauna?
I finish with a cold plunge, but a very quick one. But then I'm also now thinking, well, if that's a stressful thing, should I not be doing that before sleep?
If you're sleeping okay as a result, I think that's fine. I often make people a little bit aware that lots of cold water before bed, which is thought to be one of the things that maybe might be good for muscle recovery.
Yeah.
If it's putting your body into a state of stress and then you're having to work really hard to bring your body temperature up again, that might interfere with sleep. But if it's a short period of time, again, you give yourself time to recover, I think that's okay. The evidence suggests that actually a warm bath or shower an hour before you get into bed is really, really helpful, because what happens when you get into a warm bath or shower is that the warm water that's surrounding your body, the brain clocks that it's surrounded by warmth, and so it tries to cool you down by pushing more blood flow to your extremities. So your core body temperature falls as your kind of skin looks pink, and then you get out of the warm bath or shower and your body temperature falls quite rapidly, and that falling of core body temperature can really help to ease us into a deep sleep.
And then a cold room.
And a cold room to help your body to emit that heat, because our body temperature needs to drop by about 0.5 degree to get into and stay into a deep sleep. So heat is the enemy, which is one of the problems when you're kind of going through some hormonal flux.
Interesting. Okay, so we have actually got something for everyone. So the first one is about setting your circadian rhythm, getting out and about, early doors, bright lights, movement, food to really get stimulating. And then for those who are doing shift workers, have kids, or just have patterns where they can't actually control and set that routine, things like delaying caffeine. It was 8.8 hours, so roughly 9 hours before going to bed, stopping that. So whatever bedtime you're at, trying to reduce that, and decaffeinated options are green light as far as you're concerned. And then the final one was about the stress response. So I think you mentioned Headspace. Calm is another app that I've heard of that are amazing.
Loads of great mindfulness and breathwork apps, all of them aimed at the skill of relaxation. So you've got to find something that works for you. And it might not be a mindfulness practice. It might be listening to an audiobook that's very calming. It might be calming music. We are all different in terms of what we find gives us a sense of safety and calm, and that is what you want to find.
Yeah, amazing. And I was about to say, and now we'll go on to the audience questions, but you have answered every single one of them. We had people asking what insomnia is. You've already mentioned that. Something I think was important that you did mention, and I want to repeat it, is when does someone need to get help or look to get help if they're struggling with their sleep?
I think at the point where sleep disruption is interfering with your day-to-day responsibilities, you know, when it's really negatively impacting on your life, that does not need to happen. We have some great treatments for sleep out there. All of the things that I've mentioned have been part of a toolkit called cognitive behavioural therapy, which is a selection of different techniques to help with insomnia. The one thing that we haven't really talked about is sleep apnea, that we mentioned, you mentioned Dylan was a snorer, very common in rugby players who've got really thick set neck. And I think for people who snore loudly, or particularly for women, just feel excessively sleepy during the day despite normal amounts of sleep, that is a red flag for me. If someone says, I get 8 or 9 hours of sleep, but I still wake up feeling exhausted and I'm really sleepy during the day, I start to think maybe there's something interfering with the quality of sleep. And in sleep apnea, you have these pauses in breathing which interfere with staying in deep sleep, which brings you up to lighter stages of sleep and make you very, very drowsy. So if you suspect that that might be an issue, it's time to talk to your doctor. Just say, I'm wondering about sleep apnea. Get a sleep test that will measure your oxygen saturation overnight and tell you whether you're having these brief periods of breathlessness.
Okay, brilliant. Because I know it can be dangerous for some people as well. So it's definitely something to look into.
Very treatable though.
Amazing. Thank you so much for everything. I've selfishly just loved this entire episode. So I know everyone else will as well. We've got a little closing tradition with Finally Found, which is asking our guests, what is one thing you are so glad that you finally found, whether that's on your sleep journey or not?
I'm going to say rowing. We were talking earlier about physical activity, social contact. For me, I found it in the last probably 7 years. And it wasn't something that I used to do. It's something that brings me joy, really good for my well-being. And it's given me a challenge of rowing the Atlantic in 2026. So for me, rowing.
Which is incredible. And you're going to be sharing your journey, right, on your socials?
Of course.
So everyone, please go over and support, because I think you're raising awareness, raising money as well.
Yes, we'll be raising money for a charity called Inspiring Girls and also for the sleep charity.
That's incredible. And honestly, I don't know how you're doing it. You're so busy with your work anyway, let alone doing this on top. So we'll make sure that we put the links to everything in the show notes. And as for that, where can people find you? Because I obviously have you on socials. What is your handle?
At Dr Sophie Bostock.
brilliant. And anywhere else that people can find
And
you?
my website is thesleepscientist.com.
Amazing. Honestly, you have been such a pleasure to have on. I've absolutely loved it. And I know you'll have helped so many people. And I always knew that sleep was such a serious thing that I should be doing more of. But I think I've realised today how important it is to my hormonal health as well, which is a really, really big deal as someone with endometriosis. So honestly, thank you so, so much, Sophie. And I'm really hoping we have a season 2 because I feel like we could do so many more episodes together.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for today's episode. If you loved this conversation with Sophie Bostock just as much as I did, please make sure that you like, follow, subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, and make sure you follow the Found socials too. Everything that you need is in the show notes of this episode. And remember, sleep isn't a luxury, it's a foundation, and you're allowed to prioritize it.